Great. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Central South University and ICoRSI for the opportunity to speak briefly. What I'm going to present is a new approach that we've been looking at in our research hub, which is situated in a School of Architecture. And yes, I am in School of Engineering, but also in the School of Medicine, so across quite a number of faculties. But it allows us to, in some ways, circumvent some of the discussions we've just had around data by using mass data that's freely available and standardised to begin to explore some of the relationships between our urban form and road traffic injury. Now, one of my PhD students gave me a very fancy pointer. I'll just see if it works. It does. It does. Okay, now, and this is interesting because yesterday there was a lot of discussion around, we're doing incredibly well, and there's a great deal of success in terms of reductions in road traffic injury globally. And some of that is true. And in fact, as I point here, we have a 15% decrease in the burden of road traffic injury over sort of the last 20 odd years. And when I refer to burden of road traffic injury, I'm talking disability adjusted life years. And I think it's a very pertinent measure to be looking at, because it takes account of not only of mortality or premature mortality, but also the life lived with a disability, which is certainly the consequence of a serious injury from road traffic injury. But that success, the 15%, and I'm not going to discuss just how well we've achieved and what were the main benefactors in terms of how we delivered that, because it's a combination of vehicle safety gains, it's about a combination of infrastructure gains, it's a combination of some of the behavioural attributes that we heard about yesterday, or particularly around seatbelts and drink driving strategies and graduated driver licensing. They've all played a part, but they've played a part predominantly in parts of the globe. And certainly not the entire globe. And importantly, what we're seeing is that the global burden of road traffic injury is increasing. And it's increasing in low and middle income countries, which make up 2/3 of the world's population. So in fact, we have quite a significant crisis going on. We are on one hand saying we're doing a fantastic job. That fantastic job's actually occurred predominantly in high income countries. And in fact, we have a complex, challenging problem that is making up, which most of the world is really going to have to deal with, which is road traffic injury in low and middle income countries. And this is illustrated just by this point here, that the global burden of road traffic injury in South and Sub-Saharan Africa over the last 20 years has increased by 35%. That is a phenomenal increase. And we also see in South Asia, in India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, an increase of around 6%. So there is a substantial challenge we have here in terms of road traffic injury in the majority of where the population resides. Now, what is also unique is that the 21st century is now deemed the urban age, and urbanists here, there's a handful of urbanists here, those who study urban geography will know this very well. But for us in sort of the epidemiology public health field, it's an interesting perspective that there is this massive urban migration that is occurring globally. And the greatest migration is occurring in the majority, where the majority of the population lives, in India, in China, and in Nigeria. And so just as one example here, I used this in the paper, that in the last 10 years in China, 226 million people have moved from rural to urban areas. Now that's a phenomenal change, and that has massive implications in terms of how we respond in relation to road safety in urban areas. And coming from Australia, a lot of our focus has been, it's a highly urbanised country, but a lot of our focus has been focused around rural interventions because the mortality is highest there. But actually what we're seeing a great deal now with large cities is there's a great burgeoning of serious injuries as a result of road traffic injuries in cities. Now also with this increased urbanisation, what we're seeing is an increase in the exposure to health risks. And there are just so many benefits from migrating from rural to urban areas. along, access to health systems, education, employment, but there's also an increase in health risks and exposures in those cities. And one that we're focused on in this meeting is around the road traffic injury. And I've just listed just a few points here. That 1.3 million is incorrect because it's not attributed entirely to deaths in cities, but it's still, there are a sizable proportion of deaths occurring in our cities. But interestingly, one that often gets missed in our road traffic injury meetings is that there are 4.2 million deaths a year due to motor vehicle related air pollution. And that's a phenomenal burden. And then if you look at elements like particulate matter, 2.5 and 10, that the particulate matter is the contributor to our lung disease, respiratory disease that is increasing dramatically. It's been estimated to reduce our average life expectancy of about 1.8 years. So you can see that using our transport systems in our cities is a significant contributor to our burden of disease. And it's not just in relation to trauma, and I think that's an important point. So despite the success that we have gleaned really over the last 50 years in terms of road safety, road traffic injury prevention, and there's just an array of success measures, it is becoming more complex, particularly because we're operating, a lot of our interventions are going to have to operate in large cities. And this global mobility report that was just recently released, it's a conglomerate of the World Bank, the WHO, the FIA Foundation and many others, a number of UN agencies, basically put out this report, and they were sort of saying, look, it is important for us to focus on road safety, but actually global mobility is much more than just road safety. It is about the equity, the access, the effectiveness, and importantly the carbon footprint that the transport system is contributing to. And all of these factors must be a focus in the 21st century, and particularly in this highly urbanised world that we've become. So what that points to is this much broader response to mitigating road traffic injury is needed. And I think this is an important point. So the paper I'm just about to highlight now is I'm just skating over the surface, but what it allows us to do is use unique data that's freely available to everyone, applying some new methods to begin to explore the relationship between how our cities are designed and the influence that the design of our cities have on road traffic injury. Now, this is the results I present here are not causal in any way. They're very much exploratory, and it's more of an illustration to highlight there are techniques and applications we have right here and now that can give us some quite unique insights into how we should move forward in terms of urban form and road traffic injury. So the method that I'm just going to talk briefly about now is one that we have submitted a paper. It's currently under review in the Lancet Medical Journal, and it is the Lancet now has preprints, so before papers are accepted they are all put online, so you can actually access quite the methods behind this. I'm really not going to give lots of information on the methods, and also I've got a lot of smarter postdocs who work with me who are on top of the methods more so than I am, so I wouldn't know the detail they do. So what we've applied here, so basically we created a data set using Google Maps and the equivalent here in China, freely accessible to everybody. So we actually looked at every city over 300,000 population across the globe, and that came to 1,692 cities. It excludes cities from South Korea because their mapping systems have been blocked, so it doesn't allow access for us to be able to use Google Maps or Street View Maps or others. In each city, what we did was randomly select pockets of small 400 by 400 metre maps, and selected 1,000 for each city. So we had a database of about 1.6 million visual maps of cities across the globe. And then what we did is we took this very high-level abstraction of the urban characteristics of each city. What we were interested in were these points here. We were interested in breaking the maps down, stripping any identifying information from the maps, so anything that may have had Chinese words on it, anything that could identify that city as a unique Chinese city or a unique Scandinavian city or whatever. We broke it right down to the black lines here, which are the road networks for each city, the orange line here, which is the rail transit systems in those cities. We looked at green space in the city, and we looked at blue space in the city. So we were just looking at those 4 urban characteristics: road transport networks, rail networks, green space, and blue space. We then applied a convolutional neural network, a machine learning approach to this database. And what that's basically doing is there were 2 levels to that. We used what we refer to here as a supervised learning procedure. And in essence, what that does was the model allows us to identify whether a city comes from a specific area, whether other cities are associated with each other. So it's basically looking at those characteristics, those urban characteristics we're focused on, and it models it to see whether other cities are alike based on the same sort of urban characteristics. We then applied a graph-based analysis that also allows you to look spatially at the relationships between the cities. So basically the model clusters those cities together based on like characteristics, and then the graph analysis allowed us to look at the spatial relationship of those clusters. And as I said, the details of that are in the paper. Once we had the clusters of cities, and this is the first time these cities have been identified in terms of clusters, we overlaid the global burden of disease data for road traffic injury across those clusters. We had to weight some of the global burden of disease data because it's global burden of disease data is country level data, and we're looking at city specific level data. So there are a lot of limitations in what we're doing here, but it's to give you an exposure to how we're looking at this in a sort of an exploratory way to see if there are relationships at all. This paper specifically, what we then did was say, okay, that was global cities, let's focus on Asia Pacific cities. And so that broke this analysis down to 689 cities that we looked at in the Asia Pacific region, from Mongolia in the north to I think it was Nepal, right through to South New Zealand and Fiji Islands in the east. So this is the first snapshot as a consequence of our machine learning modelling that we undertook. And these are the first time that we've been able to highlight that there were 9 distinct clusters came out of our analysis of how cities could be clustered based on their urban topology. So basically what we're saying is these are city clusters based on the road networks, the rail networks, and green space and blue space. And we have described these clusters here. We've got, in some instances, some crude descriptions for each of these clusters, and we've also given these clusters a name, from sort of informal clusters to high transit clusters, motor city type clusters, and we actually had a panel of experts that we pulled together who comprised urban planners, urban designers and architects, transport engineers, and they came with this consensus based on viewing the typical type of maps that we were able to show for those clusters. They then came up with these descriptors of the various urban topologies. So just to give you an example here, cluster 6 is the motor city definition. This is medium to low density, high capacity grid-based road networks, medium railed transport. And if you go online to our answer paper, it will show you all the cities around the globe that fall into this cluster. But typically these cities were North American cities, Australasian cities, and there's a handful of cities across Europe that sort of fit this, but it's basically medium to low density. So it's usually a lot of urban sprawl in these cities, and very strong road networks that have been established for the motor vehicle, and not much in the way of rail in those cities. And so you can see in relation to, on the right-hand side of this table, we have the Asia-Pacific cities and how many of the Asian-Pacific cities fall into these clusters. And you can see that very few fall into this motor city cluster in the Asia-Pacific region. Only 1.7% or 12 cities fall into that type of cluster. So this slide's just highlighting the elements of the Asia-Pacific cities. So you can see that if in the Asia-Pacific region, over 64% of the cities fall into these two cluster types, informal and irregular. So if we look at the leading number of cities, 231 cities fall into what's referred to here as an irregular city topology. High green space, mixed formal and informal infrastructure, few high-capacity road networks, and limited mass transit. So that's the sort of typical cluster you're starting to see in terms of city topologies in this region of the world. And in contrast, almost no cities in Asia Pacific fall into like cluster 5, which was referred to here as a high transit. High transit's medium density, high capacity, formal road networks, and high public transport investments. So it's starting to give you a picture around the urban typologies of cities in our region here. This is just to give you another illustration here. Again, the next was the informal. The informal cluster type is a sparse, low-capacity informal road infrastructure, limited rail transport, low formal green space. Again, a lot of cities in this region fall into that type. So, I mean, it's beginning to sort of say, does our urban form influence road traffic injury, or is it the other? And this is an interesting piece of work, I think, to start to delve into. How do we, or what should we be doing in relation to our urban form in terms of mitigating road traffic injury? Now, that's a colourful slide and probably should be in an art gallery. But what it's highlighting here, and I'm going to just zoom in on this and give you an illustration, is it takes each country and it looks at the variation of city topologies within each country. So if I look at this now in relation to here, you'll see there's a great deal of homogeneity in the urban form in this part of the graph, and very mixed in this other section I've highlighted. This section here is predominantly the Asia-Pacific region cities. So I've just taken a subset of this and blown it up so you can have a closer look. So on the right-hand side here, we see cities, countries, and you'll see if we look at China, for example, there are just about every urban topology that we defined based on our machine learning is represented in China. So you've got quite a degree of heterogeneity in urban topology in China. If we look at orange here is our irregular urban topology. And irregular urban topology, I don't know them off the top of my head, is high green space, mixed formal and informal infrastructure, few high capacity road networks, and limited mass transit. So there's a vast proportion of Chinese cities that would fall into that criteria. But you'll also see it's got the brown here, which is also intense or high transit. It even has some high transit in here as well, suggesting probably that some of those East Coast cities in China are starting to become very high density, have big investments in high transit type, mass transit type systems. Interestingly, if you go to the left here, you'll see that these are all predominantly northern and western European countries, and they're all very homogeneous. They're all green. They're all the high transit. The high transit definition again: medium density, high capacity, formal road networks, and high public transport investments. And interestingly, you see the only two countries from Asia-Pacific region that fall into that category is Japan and Singapore, and both high density, massive investments in high transit mobility. So I think what we're seeing from this unique topology and beginning to explore this using standardized data, knowing that it's all the same across the globe, we're starting to see some unique elements arising out of our road infrastructure across the globe, which can be used, I think, to inform how we might better implement road traffic injury prevention strategies. So what we then did, and this is the weakest part of our analysis, in part because I've said the global burden of disease data is at a country level and not at a city level, and we need to try, and I know the GBD data is beginning to focus more on city level estimates, which would really enhance this type of work. So what we have plotted here is on the x-axis here is just the various clusters that we've been able to define. And it also, on the y-axis here, gives us the proportion of road transport and public transport networks by cluster type. So you can clearly see there's a great deal of investment in road and public transit has occurred in this cluster 5, the high transit. They're followed by the motor city, large blocks, and then it continues down to the least here in cluster 9 and cluster 2 and cluster 4. And interestingly, these make up the majority of our Asia-Pacific cities. If we plot our burden of road trauma, road traffic injury burden by Delhi's here, you can see that there is beginning to see a bit of a trend. Again, nothing causal in this, but what it's highlighting is those cities that have very informal, irregular, sparse urban topologies, high rates of disability-adjusted life years lost due to road traffic injury, those with great deal of formality to their urban topologies, greater investment in public transit, reduced rates. It varies by in this instance, pedestrian injuries. It also varies in relation to motorcycle injuries. And it also, interestingly though, when it comes to cyclist injuries, it's pretty stable right across the globe in terms of the various urban topologies for cyclist injuries. And again, this is disability-adjusted life years lost. There's a number of reasons for that, and it's not explained by the typology of the city. But what this is beginning to show us, though, is that I think the urban topology is a very important factor in understanding how we might begin to focus road traffic injury, particularly in low and middle income countries. I've run out of time, but the reason I'm saying that is, I'll just jump down to this bottom point here. Development banks are investing in transport infrastructure in the region, and they need to embrace not only road safety, but the equity, efficiency and sustainability of transport systems. Advocating for urban topology, such as high transit, could be a very valuable strategy when we're looking at investment through those development banks as a way of mitigating road traffic injury. Thank you. These are my staff who've been working hard on this and a number of other areas. Thank you.
Thank you.